200 years ago, Christmas in America looked nothing like the holiday we know today. There were no glowing storefronts in December, no Christmas music playing everywhere you went, and definitely no piles of wrapped gifts under a sparkling tree. For many Americans in the early 1800s, Christmas was barely even noticeable. To understand what it was really like, we have to forget everything modern culture has taught us and step into a world shaped by hard winters, manual labor, and deeply rooted traditions brought over from Europe. In the early 19th century, America was still a very young nation. Most people lived on farms or in small rural communities. Life didn't follow the calendar. It followed the rhythm of the seasons. Winter wasn't a time for celebration. It was a time for survival. December meant cold homes, short days, and long, dark nights. Fires had to be tended constantly just to stay warm. Food supplies had to be carefully managed to last until spring. There was absolutely no guarantee of comfort or even safety. Christmas was not yet the family-centered holiday it is today. In many parts of America, especially in New England, Christmas was actually viewed with suspicion. This attitude came from the country's Puritan roots. The Puritans believed Christmas was too closely tied to pagan rituals and Catholic traditions. They saw it as an excuse for excess, disorder, and heavy drinking. In fact, back in the 1600s, Massachusetts had completely banned Christmas celebrations. By the early 1800s, the ban was long gone, but that skeptical mindset remained. For many families, December 25th was simply another workday. If Christmas was acknowledged at all, it was quiet and restrained. You wouldn't find decorated trees in most American homes. Christmas trees were still considered a strange German custom, mostly practiced by small immigrant communities. The idea of bringing a whole tree indoors wouldn't become widespread for decades. Instead, for those who did observe it, the holiday was focused on church. Families would attend long, solemn services, often held in unheated buildings where you could see your breath in the air. The emphasis was on quiet reflection, not festivity. Gift-giving, as we know it, barely existed. Children did not wake up to stockings filled with toys. There were no toy stores overflowing with choices, and most families simply couldn't afford such things anyway. If gifts were given at all, they were small, practical, and often handmade. Maybe a knitted scarf, a simple wooden whistle, or a piece of fruit like an apple or an orange, which were considered real luxuries in the dead of winter. Sometimes the greatest gift was just having a little extra food on the table. Speaking of food, Christmas meals were not the extravagant feasts we imagine. They were modest improvements over everyday fare. If a family had managed to preserve meat, Christmas might include roast pork or poultry. Pies were common, especially mince pies filled with preserved fruits and spices. But sugar was expensive, and spices were rare, so nothing was ever wasted. Cooking a holiday meal took hours, sometimes days, of preparation. Everything was done by hand. Fires had to be kept alive. Water had to be carried from a well. Nothing came easily. And yet there was something deeply meaningful about these meals. They represented survival. Winter was a dangerous time. Illness spread easily. Travel was incredibly difficult, and communities were often isolated from one another. Sharing food, even just a modest amount, was a powerful act of trust and care. It was a way of saying, "We made it this far, together." In some towns and cities, Christmas was marked not by quiet family gatherings, but by public celebrations, and not always the kind you'd expect. In places like New York, Christmas had a rowdy, almost chaotic reputation. Groups of young men would roam the streets, going from house to house, demanding food, drink, or money from the wealthy. This tradition, known as wassailing, was loud, boisterous, and could sometimes turn violent. For the upper classes, Christmas could be a night of anxiety. It was a time when the social order felt like it was blurring. Servants expected gifts from their employers, and the poor made demands of the rich. It was a version of Christmas that looked less like warmth and nostalgia and more like social tension barely held in check. For children, the experience of Christmas was simple and brief. There was no sense that the day revolved around them. Childhood itself was much shorter back then. Kids were expected to work and contribute to the household from a young age, and Christmas didn't suspend those responsibilities. They might be allowed to stay up a little later, or they might receive a rare treat, but the next day, life went right back to normal. There was no Christmas season to build anticipation. No advent calendars, no weeks of excitement, no countdown. The idea of Christmas spirit as this warm, emotional atmosphere hadn't really been invented yet. Homes weren't elaborately decorated. At most, a family might bring in some evergreen branches or holly, ancient symbols of life in the dead of winter, to hang them over a doorway or mantelpiece. These were practical and symbolic gestures, not the decorative statements we make today. Candles were precious, so light was limited. Darkness dominated the long winter evenings. Music existed, of course, but it wasn't playing constantly. Christmas carols were sung in churches or in small gatherings at home, not broadcast everywhere. In fact, many of the songs we associate with Christmas today hadn't even been written yet. Silent Night, for example, wouldn't appear until 1818 and wouldn't reach America for several more decades. So what bound people together if it wasn't holiday cheer? It was endurance. For many Americans 200 years ago, Christmas was less about joy and more about continuity. It was a marker in the darkest part of the year, a reminder that the cycle of seasons would eventually turn and that spring would come again. Faith played a central role in this. For religious families, Christmas was about humility and devotion. The story of Christ's birth in a humble manger resonated deeply in a world where poverty, hardship, and uncertainty were everyday realities. The celebration was inward, not outward. The modern Christmas, the one that's warm, sentimental, child-focused, and highly commercial, simply did not exist yet. That huge transformation would come later in the 19th century, shaped by waves of immigration, the rise of industrialization, and influential writers like Washington Irving and Charles Dickens, who would help redefine Christmas as a season of generosity, family, and goodwill. But 200 years ago, Christmas was quieter, colder, more fragile. It existed in flickering candlelight, in simple meals, and in brief moments of rest between long, hard days of work. There were no guarantees, no excess, and no illusion of perfect comfort. And yet, for those who lived it, Christmas still mattered. Not because it was magical, but because it reminded them that they had made it through another year, another winter, another test of endurance. And sometimes, that was more than enough. Thanks so much for watching. If you found this glimpse into the past interesting, be sure to like this video and subscribe for more stories from history. See you next time.